As I mentioned in the orientation video, the parable about the elephant came to mind when I was thinking about metaphors for understanding leadership. In some ways, the different depictions of elephants provide a parallel for the way the different models and theories depict leadership. From some perspectives, leaders are special and part of an elite group. And from some perspectives, elephants are sacred. In other cases, theories focus on the style or behavior of leadership, almost like the elephant in the carousel is stylized and has a particular function. In many cases, though, perspectives on leadership are focused on the typical day-to-day interactions. As you read or listen to the overview in this presentation, you'll want to think about how different perspectives are similar and how they're different in how they explain leadership emergence, leadership effectiveness, and the leader-follower relationship. That said, I'm sure it's not surprising to hear that academics, consultants, and authors have offered numerous theories and suggestions about leadership. We could have an entire class talking about the different theories of and perspectives on leadership, and Northwest does offer a class that goes into a little bit more depth about those topics. As I mentioned in the orientation, though, our focus in this class is on the related mental states, behaviors, and psychological processes, which is a little different from the theory perspective. To understand how it's different, I thought it'd be helpful to make sure you're familiar with some of the common theories and perspectives. My goal is for you to be able to briefly explain similarities and differences, as you'll read about in the other materials in this module. I don't expect you to memorize names and dates as much as be familiar with the general ideas. That said, this is also a sample of perspectives. I selected these because they're frequently mentioned in other contexts, like management or group dynamics, and because they represent important similarities and differences from the perspective we'll take in class. One of our texts, The New Psychology of Leadership, talks a lot about the great man perspective on leadership. And the history of the perspective makes the use of man accurate, if not appropriate in contemporary understanding. That said, this is the original perspective based on century-old social norms and observations. Eventually, though, we did begin to shift towards a more scientific, and potentially less biased, perspective on what it takes to be a leader. The timeline in this slide gives an idea of how the thinking progressed, from simply looking at the qualities leaders were born with to a more refined understanding of how individuals are different. Some of the work did incorporate other variables, but the influence was still very much on the qualities of the leader. As the thinking progressed, the theories eventually became known as trait theories. The idea is still that leaders had certain qualities they're born with that make them different from non-leaders and allow them to influence others. Researchers have considered a number of those characteristics, including those noted in the graphic above, as well as other personality variables, emotional intelligence, self-confidence, determination, and others. As you might already be thinking, this theory makes sense, while also seeming a little one-sided. A strength, and a reason this perspective still influences thinking, is because it's intuitively appealing. There's a great deal of research support, too. In businesses and organizations, that can be helpful because it provides guidance on what to look for in a leader. But the contribution to understanding the overall process of leadership is limited because it's only focused on the leader. The list of traits can also be almost endless. Plus, focusing on characteristics that leaders have means we can't help individuals become leaders. I can't learn how to become taller or go through a training program to change my personality. The behavioral or style perspective was a big shift from the trait perspective and addresses some of the weaknesses of the trait theories by focusing on what a leader does, the actions of the leader. The three main contributions to understanding leader behaviors came out of work at the University of Michigan, Ohio State, and by Blake and Mouton. The three converged to describe behavior in terms of two broad categories: task behavior and relationship behavior. Those labels are probably pretty straightforward. It makes sense leaders would need to do things to accomplish tasks to achieve the goal, and that they'd need to do things to reduce interpersonal conflict within a group or other relational behaviors. Each of the three main contributors gave those slightly different names, but with the same overall idea. Initially, the Michigan researchers said that they were two ends of one continuum, In other words, the more task-oriented a leader was, the less relational they were, and vice versa. After additional research, though, those researchers changed their thinking, and now all three consider them as two separate types of behavior. It's interesting to note that each of these perspectives appears to range a bit in their intended audience, so to speak. As far as I've seen, Michigan did not produce a prominent measure of leadership behavior or a program for training managers. It appears their audience was primarily other scholars. Ohio State did produce a measure that's still in use today, suggesting they want to at least encourage ongoing work, if not influence selection or training in organizations. The Blake and Mooten grid appears to be developed for an audience of consultants and managers. The numbers and segments in the grid above correspond to different styles of management, which are associated with different levels of effectiveness. As that suggests, many leadership development programs are influenced by the idea of style, if not being influenced by these specific theories. The research finding about connection between behaviors and effectiveness could be stronger, though. This perspective is also limited because it's still primarily focused on the leader. The followers and the situation are relatively absent. The contingency theories emerged in part to address those limitations in the behavioral approaches. They incorporate both behavior and situational variables to understand leadership and assert that the type of leadership that's effective depends on the situation. Fiedler's theory is one of the most developed and representative of this perspective. Like the behavioral theories, it describes leader behavior in terms of task and relationship orientation. The measure that's used for this theory determines task and relationship orientation based on questions about the leader's least preferred coworker. So that phrase, or LPC, is used to describe the leader behavior part of the theory. The situation is described in terms of three variables. Group atmosphere is defined in terms of the degree of trust and liking within the group. Structure describes whether the task itself and rules for completing it and whether they're well defined. Position power is defined in terms of the leader's formal role. The idea is that the three situational variables combine to determine which style of management will be preferred and most effective. The combinations of the three situational variables create 9 categories, shown in this chart, with the idea being that different styles of leader will be a better fit depending on the category. One strength of this approach is that the main idea makes sense, and it's supported by research. It helps broaden the understanding in a number of ways because it not only suggests leadership is not an inborn trait, but also indicates not all leaders need to or should behave the same way. It also means this is helpful in organizations when they're trying to develop leaders for a particular situation. There's still some gaps, though, and it's not clear why behaviors and situations fit together the way they do, so that makes it tricky to address a lack of fit between the leader and the situation. It also has a few other criticisms, including we don't understand what to do if there's a leader-situation mismatch. Leader-member exchange theory, or LMX, is a more contemporary theory, and it's unique in its focus on interactions between the leaders and other members of the group, referred to as subordinates in this theory, giving an idea of the intended audience. The theory is also unique in highlighting that leaders do not interact in the same way with all members of the group. Other theories implied they did interact the same way. Initial research led to the idea that leaders have an in-group and an out-group, a distinction that probably makes sense from the language, if not from your experience. Later, the research moved into understanding the implications for effectiveness. As you might guess, being in the in-group had benefits, including better chance of promotion. There were also benefits for the larger organization, given those individuals had better attitudes, more commitment, and were less likely to leave. The experience in the out-group is obviously different, though, leading to questions of how high-quality in-group relationships are created, a question that's not been fully answered. Transformational leadership is also considered the interaction between leaders and followers, but in a much different way than LMX. In some ways, the transformational theory makes me think of great man theories, as it emphasizes the idea that the leader can help each follower individually and the group as a whole achieve more than they would have thought possible. This theory is more defined, though, than great man and emphasizes the followers as much as the leaders. With transformational leadership, followers feel empowered and nurtured. The leader is their role model and creates a vision, in groups characterized by trust and collaboration. So this describes how leaders can initiate, develop, and carry out significant changes in organizations. Transformational leadership has been the focus of a great deal of research on its own and as part of larger theories. Initially, Burns contrasted transformational and transactional leadership. Transactional was more about what the follower would receive for contributing to the group's progress. Bass expanded on that theory, as the graphic shows, with transformational being one of 3 categories of leadership. The transactional category included 3 types, including management by exception, passive, and active. The labels for which suggest the perspective was more about management and subordinates. The portion about transformational leadership has appeal across settings, though, in part because it makes sense and helps understand the process. The characteristics of transformational leadership can be ambiguous, though, so defining behaviors and helping someone learn how to be this way might be a little trickier. There's also more potential for transformational leadership to create situations that are not as beneficial for followers. I hope this overview has helped you begin to think about the similarities and differences between perspectives. One thing to keep in mind is they might not directly address emergence, effectiveness, and relationships, but it says as much about the perspective when they don't address it as when they do. As far as which theory I was thinking of when I selected the pictures, I'll let you draw your own conclusions.